Now we're going to a totally different place. We're going way back till the time when people believed in the gods, the northern gods. And I will say the names in Danish because that's easier for me, but you know the Odin is the highest of the gods. He's the father of all gods. And then there's Loki, you say, but Loki is a trickster, and he can shape shift. Yeah, he can shape shift, and he does that a lot, and he's really not doing anything without it being a benefit for himself. So, and then we have Idunn, the woman who guards the magic apples. You know her? Yes? And the story is today about how her apples were stolen. Or let's see what happens. Odin and Loki were out on a hunt the whole day, and the hunt was really not very successful, so they forgot all about time because they kept wanting and wanting to find something to eat. But as the sun was setting in the horizon, they realized they wouldn't catch anything that day, so they decided that they would have to find some food where they were. And they looked around in the landscape full of rocks and cliffs and rolling hills and fields of grass and fields of all kinds of other stuff. And then they saw a field full of cows, big fat cows. So they went out, and somehow they caught one of the cows real quickly, and they took it back. They dug a hole in the ground. They filled it up with rocks and wood that they had caught from some of the trees, and then they put the cow, they cut it up, of course, in several pieces, but then they put the cow on top of the rocks that they had heated from the flames, from the fire. And then they put some, I think it's called peat, on top of it, yeah. And then they waited. And usually I have some music with me, actually some harp music in the waiting time, but we don't have time for that now. And besides, my harp is back in Denmark. So then they found that now it would finally be finished. So they took off the peat, and then they started cutting the meat. But it was totally red and raw. So they said, well, it was too short time. So they put the peat back and waited. And now you can imagine the harp music here. And then again they took off the peat, and it was still raw. And they didn't really understand what had happened. So they started discussing what could be wrong here. And they looked around, and then finally they saw up in a tree nearby there was a huge eagle sitting up there. And the eagle started laughing and talking to them. Ha 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 ha. What in the world do you imagine that you can have this cow ripe? It's my cow, and you stole it from me. Wow. What? They didn't think that anybody else but Odin could own everything here. So the eagle flew down and came next to them, and he said, well, we can make a deal. If you can let me have all I can eat, then you can have your share of the cow as well, and I can make it ripe, tender. I can make it tender right away. And they had to agree to that, because what else would they do? They were really hungry, and their stomachs were yeah, whatever they do, rumbling. And then they got hardly anything because the eagle ate most of it. It turned out that the eagle was one of the giants called Chasse. Chasse was from the giant's land, and he had put on his feather coat and flown out to look after his cows. And now he had eaten most of the cow, but Loki and Odin were still very hungry. And Loki got really angry, so he grabbed a tree. He took the trunk of a tree and he just started hitting the eagle. But what happened was that there were some branches that got caught in the feather coat, and then Loke held on to the stem, and the eagle started flying, and Loke was lifted up in the air. And he said, oh, no, please, you have to let me go. But the eagle just kept flying really low, so Loke's legs were catching on the rocks and the ground, and it really hurt. So he said, you have to let me down because I knew your grandfather, and he was a really nice man, and we were friends. But then Chasa said, you could possibly not have known my grandfather because he's dead many, many years ago. I knew your grandfather, I promise you. And he would never have let this happen. How could you know my grandfather? Well, because I'm very old. Well, you don't look old. And this was before the beauty industry and everything. So that was really, how could that happen? But then Loke said, well, we do have the magic apples, you know, Idunn's apples. They keep us young. We have one each week. She hands them out just like that. One each week, that keeps us forever young. Chasa said, I want some of these apples. Well, actually, I want them all. Well, no, that's not going to happen, Loke said, because you can't get her apples. She's guarding them like they were gold. Well, that's your problem, said Chasa. If you want to come down, you have to get me the apples. So Loke had to promise he would bring the apples. And he was let down. He came back to Odin, and they went back to the Asgard, the home of the gods. Sorry. Then nothing happened, and Loke didn't really say anything about what he had promised. But one day he kept walking next to Idunn. She was walking in the forest, and he went up to her and he said, oh, you're really looking good today. And you know, women like flattering, so she let him talk to her. And then he said, I have actually found some apples in the forest that are much better than your apples. Oh no, I don't believe that, she said. That can't be true. But he said, I promise you I can prove it. So you have to take some of your apples and we can go into the forest and I can show you. Then they went into the forest. She brought her apples and they came to a place in the forest where there were not that many trees. It was very light. And then there was a big shadow coming in the sky. And Loke knew what was happening, but Idunn didn't know. But she started shivering and said, something is wrong here. Well, before she could think about what was wrong, Chasa, the eagle, had dived down and caught her and flew away with her. Well, as you can imagine, Loke didn't come back to the other gods for a while. And what happened was that they started having gray hair. And this was before you could get any hair dye. So they could tell that they had gray hair. And also Odin, he started having a really sore back, so he had to use a stick for walking. And the joints of the gods started hurting, and everything was going very slowly. So one day there was one of the gods who said, what is happening with us? And by the way, where's Idunn? Well, nobody really knew where Idunn was, but then there was one person who had seen her leave and going into the forest with Loke. Uh-oh, they knew Loke had been doing something. So Odin he looked around for Loke and finally he found him and he shook him and he said, I'm going to kill you if you don't get the apples back. And Loke said, well, I can't do that. But Odin said, you have to do it. And then he said, okay, well, if I can borrow Freya's feather coat so I can fly like a raven, it's going to be fine. And then they agreed that he could borrow that because they wanted the apples back. So Loke flew away to the land of the giants, and then he saw, when he was very close to the ground, he saw that Idunn was walking around with her apples. And there was no Chasa to be seen. He had gone on a fishing trip. But Loke, you know, he could change anything. So he turned her into a nut that he could dive down and he could grab it in his claw. and then he flew back in a hurry. But at that moment, Chasse came back from his fishing trip, and he hurried and he took on his eagle coat, and he flew after Loke. Back home in Asgard, the gods were waiting for Loke to come home. And then they were so anxious, now they could hardly walk anymore because that's how old they had become. So they were just waiting, staring at the sky, waiting for Loke to come. And they prepared a fire so that he could warm himself when he came back, and Idunn also, because it's cold out there in the land of the giants. And then they saw Loke coming, and they pointed to him that he should land away from the fire. And then they saw Chasse following him. He had almost caught up with him. And then they guided Chasse to come closer, 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 and then they guided him to land right in the fire. And of course, you know, feathers catch fire, and Chasse caught fire, and that was the end of him. But Loke threw the nut to the ground, and there was Idunn, back in her old self, with the apples, and of course the gods hurried to get the apples, and then they celebrated that they had conquered Chasse, but they had gotten Idunn and the magic apples back. And the story doesn't end there, but it's for now.